In this video, I'm going to explain to you the two most important factors when choosing gear for a head-fi or even a hi-fi hobby. And this is based on something I encountered often on Reddit or forums where people would ask about buying particular gear and if it was any good, but there was some information missing. And it's rather like I encountered in the past where people would ask for computer help saying, how do I do this thing? And then I'd ask, well, hold on, why do you want to do that thing? And it turned out that they had some problem which they thought that the solution they had selected was correct when it really wasn't. And hobbies like head-fi are very similar. What ideal gear to buy can be very difficult because there's a lot out there and not helped by a bunch of complex information which is hard to digest, added to by people spewing out generic information which is not always really correct. This is something I don't see posted enough when people ask about what headphones, earphones, or other gear they should buy. Firstly, what music do you listen to? There is not only so many varieties of genres of music, but even within a genre such as pop music, there is a variety of styles of recording it, especially if you go from the 70s through to the modern era. The way music has been recorded has changed significantly. So even if you like one particular genre, the quality of that music and the style of mastering could change very considerably, and this will strongly affect what kind of gear will be ideal for you, especially what headphones and earphones, as everyone's ears are a little bit different, and different headphones and earphones will have slightly different tunings, often to make them good for different styles of genres or different types of music. For example, pop music, which I just mentioned. If you listen to something like Julie Driscoll, which was recorded in the 1970s, you'll find that even if you turn the bass right up on any kind of EQ, it doesn't get any bassier. And that's because literally there is no bass in Julie Driscoll's music. It is bass free. It is very, very odd. It reminds me a little bit of a more modern example, how Metallica actually had a lot of their music mastered with a very little bass. But if you go through later eras of pop music, through the 80s, there was bass in there, but it wasn't very strong. And if you come through to modern pop and rock, that you'll find that there's plenty of bass in modern mastering. And so that the ideal headphones for each era sometimes can be quite radically different. Much more bass strong headphones with earlier eras, where modern eras don't need bass strong headphones at all, and even bass light headphones may be ideal. Also, of course, the obvious one is genres. If you listen to, say, hip-hop, rap, maybe even techno, versus someone who listens to jazz, classical, or other acoustic music, that is music with acoustic instruments, guitar, classical instruments, and the like, what you really appreciate in terms of gear and headphones is going to be different. A lot of it does come down to how much bass and treble you have, whether you have a more neutral sound signature where you want to focus on the quality of the instruments versus something that has maybe bass strong or treble strong to some degree to get more of an enhanced experience with the genres that you like. To give an extreme example, one of the very first records I bought, a literal LP, back when I was in high school, was Van Halen's OU812. And embarrassingly, it took me a few years before I got the joke. But even on my father's nice Thorens and SME Tonarm turntable, I noticed that the recording quality wasn't so great. So maybe I was just set up for this kind of hobby in the beginning. But that means that I can appreciate Van Halen's recordings, even though they aren't recorded so well in the studios that were never quite ideal. I don't need expensive gear to appreciate them. I can listen to Van Halen in the car and enjoy it. I can listen to it on a pair of, say, Meze 105s. And expensive gear, such as a lot of the stuff behind me, doesn't really benefit it when I'm listening to their albums. Let's not talk of me getting into Sammy Hagar before David Lee Roth, but I was a bit backwards there. But that wasn't my fault. Another example on totally opposite end of the spectrum is an album called Jazz in the New Harmonic, Primal Scream by David Chesky. It's a dark jazz album. It's very off the wall, and I kind of like off the wall stuff sometimes. It has the most amazingly reproduced cymbals of any album I have heard. I sometimes use it for testing, and I'm careful not to over-listen to it because I don't want to lose appreciation of it. But it's the kind of music, to give an example, I would not listen to in the car because it is impossible to appreciate in such a noisy environment and very difficult to appreciate with gear that is less expensive. I often wonder, actually, if I tried it on a $100,000 hi-fi system how good it could get, but I don't think I'm going to be going anywhere near that for a very long time. But still, it's the music I get out when I use the best equipment that I have around and want to appreciate even the subtleties of even the slightest cymbal hits and the decay of each note. It is really a fantastic album. So just like I can't listen to David Chesky in the car, I can't really listen to Van Halen on expensive gear. It doesn't really benefit me. It's not something I would use for, say, testing equipment with. And those are probably the most extreme examples I can think of, whereas everything else will fall somewhere in the middle. A lot of music, modern music actually, is recorded even very well because you can buy good quality recording gear for relatively little versus the past. And setting up a recording studio and getting all the materials is not quite so difficult. So a strong factor there is the music you like. How much of it do you want to focus on increasing the ability to perceive the subtleties of the players when they play or sing? Or is impact and slam more important? Say if I'm listening to Spoon or Dead Can Dance or Spongle. Actually, Spongle probably does both. It does sound really good on high-end gear as well. So what you want to get out of the music you listen to is very important, and something maybe just people aren't aware of and don't really consider because they don't know what you can get out of the hobby. And one of the other factors which is very important is number 2, how loud do you listen? This is something that's not really considered. Now, you shouldn't be listening very loud. I don't listen over 90 decibels of average volume very often, and maybe that's just the kind of peaks in the music. Something people don't consider is that when you're listening quietly versus when you're listening loud, the demands on the electronics vary considerably. A speaker example is probably better here. Is a big difference between having a quiet listen to some jazz in the background versus, say, trying to reproduce a concert hall in your living room. Similarly, if you want some quiet, relaxed listening to something like, again, jazz or classical versus trying to rock out to some more powerful music, especially bass-heavy music, and very especially some movie soundtracks, then the kind, not only the headphones, but the amplification that you buy will be very critical. And that's because for every 10 decibel increase in loudness, you get 10 times the power required to drive your headphones or speakers. So that means if you're going from quiet listening at 70 decibels, whereas conversation level is about 60, up to 90 decibels, which is getting into loud, that's 100 times the power requirement. Now, with a lot of people buying portable gear these days, probably a good example is a small portable DAC amp like the Cayenne RU9 has the same power output as my big ALO Audio Studio 6 tube amp. However, there is a reason that the Studio 6 is going to drive headphones a lot better, and that's capacitance, the ability to store extra capacity to deal with the peaks and dips in music. The problem that you get online is people say, hey, will this device drive my headphones adequately? And people look up the numbers and they say, well, the headphones have this impedance and this sensitivity, and you plug the numbers in, and to get to 110 decibels, for example, which might be a peak level, then you only need X number of milliwatts, and yeah, it'll be fine, when they don't actually consider that that is just a single number. It assumes in a way that you are just dealing with a steady state signal, like the power out of a battery or something that doesn't change. It doesn't consider that a music signal is constantly changing, much like you can get a cheap car and an expensive sports car, and they can both get to 60 miles an hour or whatever. But if you put them on a twisty road, like a music signal, if you laid it flat and zoomed in on it, it would look like a twisty road. The cheaper car is going to have a lot of trouble keeping up with the twisty bits versus the high-powered sports car. And forgive me for using a car analogy for this, but that is much how it is with electronics. And that is why, for example, the Studio 6, despite having the same amount of power output of the RU9, or even only having half the amount of power output of a Schiit Audio Magni, it will still drive headphones far better than the Magni, whereas the Magni, it'll start to sound a little bit out of control, especially in the bass, whereas the Studio 6 will be drifting along as if it's not there. So really the key things are, what music do you listen to, and what do you wish to get out of that music from buying better gear? More resolution, more slam, more fun in general, a better experience. And it can be hard to define those things if you don't know where you're going in the first place. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Am I on the money, or is there something I've missed? I look forward to seeing what you have to say.